What if the most dangerous man in the American military was not the enemy, but one of its own generals, a man so brilliant, so reckless, and so utterly uncontrollable that the President of the United States and the future President had to quietly decide his fate behind closed doors, in the shadow of a war that was already won? If you've ever wondered what really happened to George S. Patton after the guns fell silent in Europe, stay right here, because this story goes far deeper than any textbook will ever tell you. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us what you already know about Patton, because by the end of this you may want to reconsider everything. It was the autumn of 1945, and the war in Europe had been over for months. The flags had been raised, the parades had filled the streets of New York and London and Paris, and the world was exhaling for the first time in 6 years. But in the ruins of Bavaria, in a town called Bad Tolls, General George Smith Patton Jr., commander of the Third Army, conqueror of hundreds of miles of European territory, the man Hitler himself had called the most dangerous general the Allies possessed, was not celebrating. He was furious. Patton had been reassigned from command of the Third Army to lead the 15th Army, a largely administrative force tasked with compiling the history of the war. To a man who lived for the thunder of tank treads and the chaos of the battlefield, it was an insult wrapped in a title. He had already been reprimanded twice, once in 1943 in Sicily for slapping a hospitalized soldier he believed was a coward, a scandal that nearly ended his career, and now in the peace he had helped win he was being silenced again. Dwight David Eisenhower, then Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, received a message in October 1945 that he could not ignore. It was not a battlefield report. It was not a tactical briefing. It was a transcript, a record of words spoken by Patton himself at a press conference on September 22, 1945, words so inflammatory, so politically explosive, that they sent shockwaves from Frankfurt to Washington and back again. Patton had compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties of the United States, casually dismissing the denazification program that the Allied Control Council had mandated as essential to rebuilding Germany. He said that governing Germany without using former Nazis would be like trying to run Pennsylvania without the help of Democrats or Republicans. The room had gone silent. And then the world had erupted. Harry S. Truman, who had become President of the United States just 5 months earlier upon the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, had been watching Patton for months with deep unease. Truman was a straightforward man, a former artillery captain himself from World War I, someone who understood soldiers but also understood politics with a precision that Patton utterly lacked. When the transcript of Patton's press conference reached the White House, Truman's reaction was unambiguous. He believed that Patton's statements were not just foolish, they were a betrayal of everything the war had been fought to achieve. Millions of people had died destroying Nazism, and here was one of America's most celebrated generals treating its remnants like a minor political inconvenience. Truman made his feelings known to the Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and through back channels the pressure on Eisenhower became immense. Eisenhower and Patton had known each other for decades. They had been friends, rivals, colleagues, and at times, something close to adversaries despite wearing the same uniform. Eisenhower had protected Patton during the slapping incident in Sicily in 1943, arguing successfully to General George C. Marshall that Patton's genius on the battlefield was irreplaceable. He had brought Patton back for the Normandy campaign, using him brilliantly as a decoy to mislead the Germans about the location of the invasion, then unleashing him to command the Third Army in the breakout from Normandy in August 1944. Patton had driven his forces across France with a ferocity and speed that stunned even his own superiors. But now, in the peace, Eisenhower could no longer shield him. The message from Washington was clear, and Eisenhower, the supreme diplomat as much as the supreme commander, knew what he had to do. On October 2, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt, Germany. The meeting was tense, private, and charged with the weight of everything the two men had been through together. Eisenhower told Patton directly that he had two choices: either accept a transfer to command the 15th Army, already his assignment in form, or be relieved entirely. Patton, who had spent the previous weeks making more controversial statements, including suggesting that the United States should immediately rearm German soldiers and confront the Soviet Union before it grew too powerful, a sentiment that was not entirely without strategic logic, but was politically catastrophic, walked out of that meeting with his command effectively stripped. Patton told his aide, Colonel Charles Codman, that he believed his career was finished. He was right. And deep down, perhaps some part of him had always known this moment would come. What makes this story so extraordinary, and so deeply human, is what was happening simultaneously on the other side of the political spectrum. While Truman and Eisenhower were managing the crisis of Patton's words, the American public remained almost entirely unaware of the full scope of the conflict. To millions of Americans, Patton was a hero, pure and uncomplicated, the man who had broken the German siege at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the man who had driven his tanks across the Rhine, the man whose name alone had reportedly caused German commanders to shift their defensive lines. The contrast between the public image and the private reality was enormous, and it was a contrast that both Truman and Eisenhower worked carefully to manage. Neither wanted a public spectacle. Neither wanted Patton's removal to become a political crisis at a moment when America was trying to rebuild a shattered world. If you've made it this far into this story, you already know this is not the version of history that gets taught in schools, and there is so much more to uncover. Subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II, because this is the part they left out. Leave a comment below and tell us, did you know that Eisenhower and Patton had this kind of confrontation after the war ended? We read every single comment. Patton was officially relieved of command of the Third Army on October 7, 1945, and assigned to lead the 15th Army, a command so small and so administrative that it was barely a command at all. He threw himself into the work with the discipline that had always defined him, even as the fire inside him was clearly dimming. His personal diaries and letters from this period, later published and studied extensively by historians, reveal a man who felt not just professionally diminished but existentially lost. Patton had defined himself entirely by war, by the act of commanding men in motion across a battlefield, by the noise and danger and terrible glory of combat. Without it he seemed to shrink. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice, in November 1945, telling her that he felt like a ghost walking through a world that had moved on without him. He spoke of returning home to their farm in South Hamilton, Massachusetts, and trying to find some quieter purpose. It was a Patton almost no one had ever seen, not the snarling, ivory-handled pistol-wearing legend, but a tired old soldier looking for a reason to keep going. On December 9, 1945, George S. Patton went hunting near Mannheim, Germany, with his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay. On the way back, their staff car was struck by a U.S. Army truck at a railroad crossing. The collision was relatively low speed, the kind of accident that might have left everyone shaken but uninjured. But Patton, seated in the back, was thrown forward and struck the partition between the passenger compartment and the driver's seat. He suffered a severe fracture and dislocation of his cervical spine, a broken neck that left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. He was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where the finest Army medical personnel available worked desperately to stabilize him. For 12 days he lingered, conscious and lucid for much of the time, receiving visitors, dictating thoughts, and facing his end with the same combination of arrogance and quiet courage that had defined his entire life. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died in his sleep of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, complications of his injuries. He was 60 years old. When the news reached Harry Truman at the White House, accounts suggest that the president paused for a long moment before speaking. Whatever his private frustrations with Patton had been, Truman understood what had been lost. He ordered that Patton be buried in Luxembourg at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army, men who had followed him across Europe and died doing it. It was exactly what Patton had requested. Eisenhower, who would go on to become the 34th President of the United States in January 1953, rarely spoke about Patton in public in the years that followed. But in his memoir, published in 1948, he acknowledged that Patton was the most technically gifted combat commander he had ever known, a man of almost supernatural battlefield instinct, and almost no political instinct whatsoever. It was a fitting epitaph from the man who had both elevated and ultimately ended his career. The story of what Truman said when Eisenhower received that message about Patton is not simply a story about one general's fall from grace. It is a story about the impossible tension between military genius and political reality, between the kind of men wars create and the kind of world peace demands. It is a story about loyalty and betrayal, about friendship under impossible pressure, about the brutal truth that history does not always reward its greatest warriors with the endings they deserve. George Patton did not die on a battlefield, and in many ways, that was the cruelest thing the universe could have done to him. He deserved better, and so does history when it is told completely and honestly. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it told you something you did not know before, subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who believes they know the full story of World War II. And leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most, because stories like this one only survive when people like you refuse to let them be forgotten.